Well, thank you so much for having us. This is an excellent session, as I hope you'll all agree with me at the end. And I want to jump right in because we have three very different experts up here. And this session is on mediated identities, imaginations, convenient truths. We could cover about 57 PhDs just within the title of this panel. I think we're going to take it in a couple different directions. But really, in recent years, there's been lots of concern around mis and disinformation, realities online and offline with polarizing filter bubbles, what this means for communities. This polarization also brings up different points of concern for identities that have long been perhaps seen as solid, national identities, certain borders. Lots is perhaps now in question. One thing we'll try to tease out is what parts of this feel new and different, and what parts of this have maybe existed for a long time and are being repackaged or reappropriated within new technologies. Obviously, the concept of hate or violence or war or genocide predates the internet, but there's also a lot of concern that these new technologies are proliferating harms or vulnerabilities in new ways. So we all know everyone has naturally layered identities. I'll be looking at this as your moderator through the lens of terrorism and violent extremism, which is my expertise, but my panelists have a lot of different expertise, and maybe we could start with Helani. You've done some incredible poignant research in Myanmar, which obviously has made headlines for not all the right reasons in recent years. And you did work off of 300 digital platform workers, internet users, marginalized communities. What were some of the findings that you were seeing within this interplay?
Thank you. So I guess the first thing, if you think about identity, not from a PhD thesis point of view, but it's that we present multiple identities is not at all a new thing, and I'm sure the other speakers will add to that. And you look at Gossman's work in the 50s, which refers to 1920s. This idea of different selves presented to people is not uncommon at all. We saw it with when the phones came, and it has translated into the digital. So when mobile phones came, many studies were done observing multiple SIM usage to present different personalities to different people, right? But there was possibly a stronger connection to the physical self at that time. Now what you see is a lot of personality or projection of identity online, which slightly less connection. It doesn't have to be, you can be a completely different person or multiple different people. So in our research in Myanmar, so in the nationally representative sample, the first thing we saw is that just over 40% of people had more than one Facebook account. And then in the qualitative approach, what you see is the reason they have it. I mean, a few of them, it's because they have lost their, access to the account, but most of them do it intentionally to present different identities. And it has sort of different consequences, right? So one is political. Almost everyone has a Burma Buddhist identity, and it's a male identity that they create. They can be a Rakhine female, they can be a Shan, non-binary, but they have a Burma Buddhist identity online, at least one of their accounts. And that's most of the time political, to engage in the public sphere over political conversations, because the kind of hate and targeting they get as a minority of any kind is much more than as a majority male. So that's political speech that's enabled by that. It's also about safety, about having conversations, about making money. So for example, a lot of translators, there's a huge LGBTQ community who do a lot of language translations, but on the internet, they don't present that. Or their non-binary self. It's also hugely economic, where you hide your true identity and do a lot of gig work, right? So, and this identity is normal, and I think tribalism, it's presented as a problem that we are fragmenting, but tribalism is not necessarily a small fragmentation. There are lots of people who find their tribe online because the tribe they live in the physical world is not accepting of them. So actually for minorities, that tribe is somewhere else and in cyberspace, so it's not always a bad thing.
I think that kind of flips our initial topic almost to a 180, because some of what you're saying is that in misinformation, in having a fake identity, there's actually an opportunity structure in the online space for a minority community that might otherwise not have an opportunity. So by creating almost this fake identity, they're giving themselves an opportunity through the online space, through the anonymity that provides. Obviously, there's consequences to that sort of proliferation as well. Looking at from that bottom-up approach to the top-down approach, maybe I'll jump over to you, Adam. Obviously, you've done a lot of work on cybersecurity and emerging technologies, lots of recent work on shifts or learnings in China. I'm sure you're also tracking the US making a decision on Twitter right now. What are you seeing as major geopolitical shifts based on your concerns around information operations?
Yeah, thank you, Erin. So what we're clearly seeing is lots of nation states learning and getting better, diffusing of techniques to each other, and changing the targeting, the types of targeting. In particular, China has traditionally, most of the I/O that we saw was really amplification of traditional messaging from state media. So just taking messages about the rise of China, how China is a responsible player internationally, how China has dealt with COVID so much better than any other country, and creating social media that just amplifies that and disparages the US's approach or kind of denigrates US democracy. We're beginning to see a shift of focusing on some of more of the areas where the Russians have traditionally played. So playing on social divisions, trying to impersonate US citizens, and play on issues like abortion and gun rights and other things there. Most of the accounts the Chinese have been setting up have been extremely low engagement. You look at the numbers, very, very few people actually see it or engage with it. But we're beginning to see them become more sophisticated, grow more of an audience. And we're beginning to see, as I said, kind of more messaging on these divisive things. So Mandian just released a report this week that said messaging around the elections, trying to dissuade people from voting, from coming out, claiming that the US was behind the explosion with Nord Stream. And so we're clearly seeing a move away from just traditional state media to more divisive kind of messaging.
Maybe jumping geographically just so we can cover as much of the world as possible on this to see a sense check, a pulse of what the world is feeling like. I'd love to jump over to you, Sonja. You've done some really good work as well more on the processes of radicalization side and what some of that means for vulnerable aspects of communities more in Germany and across Europe. And I wonder if you could talk us through what that context in Germany and Europe looks like when we think about radicalization and disinformation. And perhaps, when we think of vulnerable communities, sometimes we think of that in terms of minority groups based on ethnicity, but I know you've also done a lot of work on journalists and journalism, yourself being a journalist. That in and of itself is sometimes a vulnerable community.
So in 2021, a man walked into a gas station in Germany near the city of Frankfurt to buy some beers, and the cashier didn't want to sell him the beer because the man didn't wear a mask. So he asked him to leave the shop. So the man came back later with a gun and he shot the young man, 20 years old, dead. Experts in Germany have long, since years, warned of the radicalization of groups like the Querdenken movement. It's roughly translated to queer thinking, but it's basically a hub for right-wing extremists, people who want to resist the corona measures in Germany and perceive the state as a kind of corona Nazi dictatorship. Also supporters of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which is Germany's newest right-wing party that is also has members in parliament at the moment. This became an extremely toxic hub that existed before the pandemic, but the pandemic kind of like work like a catalyst for this movement, what we also see in Latin America, in the US. So it's kind of like fuel for these different ideologies. The government is depicted as the enemy, as I said, as a dictatorship, and the media kind of a helping hand. So traditional media are also a new enemy for these movements. These right-wing or extreme movements have created their own ecosystems that become more news ecosystems or disinformation ecosystems that become more and more professional. So they've established their own blogs, websites, microsites on Twitter, on Facebook, and they also have established a network of various Telegram groups, messenger groups, also groups on WhatsApp that are a bit harder to monitor. This creates a toxic stream of disinformation that also targets minority groups. So, for example, in Germany, there is a lot of resentment against migrants. So there was a big rise of hate speech and also digital attacks on migrants in 2015, when Germany received a lot of Syrian refugees. And it hasn't stopped. So now there are sentiments against, for example, digital attacks on Ukrainian refugees, which is also fueled by Russia. So it's kind of a mix. There are these attacks on feminism, these attacks on diverse lifestyle, like queer communities that we also see in the US. It's a common playbook. And it's a mix of non-state actors that are either radicalized or just share that misinformation because they don't know it better. But also states. For example, in Germany, Russia they fed narratives like the disinformation of an alleged rape of a Russian girl into these news systems. So, Germany has banned the Russian TV broadcasters, Sputnik and Russia Today. But nevertheless, this Russian disinformation is still in the social networks in the German sphere also. We have seen a rise on also offline attacks on Jewish people in Germany, Jewish Germans, rise of digital anti-Semitism, rising attacks like digital and offline on queer communities, and also like a lot of feminists are targeted online and some get also threatened offline. This blend of toxic disinformation leads to an erosion of trust into the institutions like the media, but also the governments. And there's also like a rising violence against journalists. For example, like in 2022, 80 journalists were attacked. 2/3 of these incidents happened close or at these protests of the queer movements. So there's a clear link, and these are also new levels for Germany. I also work in Mexico, where it's a different, to give some context, it's a different thing. Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries for journalists who report on organized crime, political corruption. So that's another level, but for Germany, a pretty resilient democracy, this is a new thing. So just very briefly, what that means for a media organization. So media has very clearly lost its gatekeeper role, which is not necessarily just a bad thing. And they have to compete in a more fragmented ecosystem of news, have to seek digital channels, have to improve their audience channels, strategies, and provide more meta information to their audiences. That means we have to make more transparent, for example, what are our information sources, what is the funding for some stories, what led us to the results of an investigation, for example. And many media companies also have reacted with fact-checking teams in-house, but also external fact-checking teams, and they also provide these to audiences. And one good thing is also that these information crisis has created new links between different countries affected internationally. For example, there are new fact-checking alliances with 80 partners worldwide who kind of created a database during the pandemic to collect and to verify the disinformation that is circulating worldwide related to corona, which helps journalists in their daily work. The problem is debunking doesn't always help. So if I tell people that what they read is not correct, a lot of people don't want to hear it because we don't want to be told, right, what we have to think. So there's the disinformation crisis, misinformation crisis is really like a big challenge not just for journalists, but also for the society as a whole, for state institutions, for analysts. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the debate.
So we've covered quite a bit of the world, some topics throughout Latin America, Europe. We've got China, US, parts of Asia. Maybe jumping back to the fact that we've been talking about misinformation, disinformation, worries about online spaces maybe being less regulated, and as a consequence, we have started seeing, just in the last couple of years, a much more intense focus on regulation from the top down, from governments. Maybe jumping back to you, Helani, you have done some work on reviewing some of the policies and legislations coming out from across Asia. What is that starting to look like? What consequences is that going to have? And obviously, one policy might be made for all the good intentions, but sometimes one policy to try to protect free speech might go against one trying to protect privacy or security. What is that dynamic looking like?
I mean, let's not assume that our countries make policies with good intention, but what it has done absolutely is made the governments sort of wake up and recognize that there's a real need to moderate, control content. And they're doing it through various means. So things like the Prevention of Terrorism Act is often, or the telecom law, various ranges of laws are used. And for example, I think Bangladesh is coming up now with new rules that would force platforms to take down content. Singapore has the POFMA, which says between 24 hours to 7 days, you have to take down certain content that's identified as problematic or hateful, etc., right? Malaysia came up with a fake news law that got repealed, but then really through the emergency regulation that, kind of surreptitiously came back into the law, etc. So where there are these laws, there are obviously the problems of vague definitions of what is hate speech, what is disinformation. Second is who decides that, right? And the third is the process that has gone through. So the new piece of legislation came when Parliament was actually not sitting during a sort of an emergency, time when the Parliament was not sitting. So this sort of, surreptitiously creeps in. COVID was used in many countries for health-related content, which then applies to other content as well. So there's multiple problems. And then the selective application of these laws is a real problem, right? So, I mean, in Sri Lanka, we have had years of anti-Muslim hate speech propagated by the Buddhist clergy online and offline in temples and in newspapers. Same in Myanmar, right? But when the Easter bombings happened in April of 2019, I think, and then suddenly a lot of content, even the Muslims who were fighting against ISIS extremism, was suddenly taken to the courts and the police came and picked them up without seeing the nuances, right? So certain type of hate speech is problematic as the government determines it, but other types are not. So that's a real problem. And running through most of this are two factors. One is, in a genuine state actor, you can expect the rule of law to work and have recourse when your content is taken down. And the same law, for example, POFMA or something like the NetzDG, in a poorly governed, non-democratic country will have very different consequences. And that's the problem of these copy-paste laws. So Sri Lanka is too small to have even a Facebook registered office. So there's no way they can get content removed. So what they do is the classic thing of many other countries, which is force the ISPs, whose licenses they control, block content completely or block specific Facebook content, right? So they use whatever they can, the tools they can. The ICCPR, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, has been used in Sri Lanka to put people in jail. Now, that's not the intention of the ICCPR under any circumstance, right? But so it's almost like the laws don't matter if you have a bad state actor, because they can use whatever. I mean, we've seen people being charged under 4 different statutes just in case the court says the first, second, and the third don't hold. So they try everything possible to curb speech they don't like. So it's not so much a carrying of disinformation. And I think the final point is on this definition. So like Bangladesh's law says, things related to the liberation war of 1972, things that paint it in a bad way. I mean, sort of, things that should really be about free speech, harmony, sort of national pride. These are these language that creeps in South Asia when you're talking about what defines disinformation.
It's a really interesting point that we might feel very differently if the same language of a legislation in company X were used by company Y, and obviously we're all going to have our own personal opinions of what countries, Freudian slip, what countries might be good for that legislative wording and what countries might be bad for that. It's also an interesting one that maybe the dynamic hasn't come up, that we kind of talk about the internet as a homogenous realm, but actually some companies have massive staff, some dropping in number right now as we speak perhaps, but most companies are actually quite small. I mean, we have membership to work with us on counterterrorism. Companies need to make a baseline, and we sometimes talk to a company that they have millions of global followers but only a staff of 11, and they have to outsource a lot of moderation to other countries where they're not based. And so you can imagine the nuance of understanding hate speech. And as you mentioned, some of the legislation has required time removals. And we know that for a lot of these smaller companies, they're not going to have in-house expertise on all these different nuanced topics. So if a government flags something, they're just going to end up removing it because they really don't have the capacity to do anything else, which leads to some other concerns. Jumping over, I know that, Adam, you've been following some of the legislative debate on both sides of the pond, on both America with Section 230, if maybe you want to give a few thoughts on what that is starting to look like. That debate's been ongoing, but also with the CAC in China, and more recently, where a lot of attention has been going on things like algorithmic transparency and what that might look like in real terms.
I'll start with China because it's easier. So clearly we saw a crackdown and tighter controls around the Party Congress. Short protest with a person unfurling a banner in Beijing that was quickly censored, and any reference to Xi and third term and all that things were all clearly stamped down and controlled very, very quickly. CAC has been, the Cyberspace Administration of China has been involved in, numerous campaigns over the last year and a half, 2 years of cracking down on live streaming and other types of new social media. As you said, I think the most interesting thing that we've seen from the CAC, and people are waiting to see how it works out, is that we've had the first set of Chinese companies submit their algorithms for this new ruling on algorithmic transparency. So we're waiting to see, how that's interpreted and how that's actually implemented, and if the companies have to make any changes based on that. U.S. side is a big old mess, I think is the simplest way to say it. Like most things, and completely kind of bipartisan, right? So the right sees too much censorship and takedowns based on free speech concerns, and big tech is in the pocket of the Democratic Party and woke America, and the left is increasingly concerned about misogynistic, anti-trans, racist violence, and so wants more moderation and things there. As you said, Elon Musk took control of Twitter this evening or this morning, whatever time it is here. Everyone's expecting that. I saw on Twitter that there would Trump's account might be reinstated November 1st, so that'll be fun. I would say the big issues, as you said, are both at the state level and national legislation. So Texas passed a law that said the companies could not take down material that was political. A court has supported that original ruling on that thing, but that's definitely going to go to the Supreme Court. Most people seem to think that will probably be struck down for First Amendment reasons, but who knows for sure. And then there is, as you mentioned, there is on the left and the right, and the Democrats and the Republicans, some sense of a need for revision of Section 230 of the Communications Act, which is, allows, provides intermediary liability for the companies and allows them to take down, to censor for content for, for users for a whole range of reasons. But what that would actually look like is, I think, very unclear. The bills themselves, there's several bills that are addressing that, and the implications for free speech seem to be pretty significant. Not clear if they would also survive a Supreme Court challenge.
All right, I'm going to open it up to questions. I know we have some microphones on either side, and oh, good. I was like, if there's a pause, I'll ask another one, but no, we seem to have sparked some interest. So over to my left, if you don't mind introducing yourself and saying where you're coming from and asking your question.
Sorry. Good morning, everyone. My name is Svetlana Zens. I'm based in Myanmar, and I have a question to Helani, because we have a common ground on Myanmar case. Louder? Okay. So the question is actually a very spicy one about content. I don't know how many of you, and I will be surprised, know OnlyFans platform. So it's basically a platform for posting adult content. And a few weeks ago, a model, Myanmar model, was arrested for posting this content. And she was given 6 years of prison. And justification was for harming culture and dignity. What is your take on this content? Would, let's say, be better if regulator would ask the OnlyFans platform just to take down the content she posted? Or just ask herself to remove this content? Or would it be a case when we could kind of argue on the freedom of expression and the right to this content to exist? Thank you.
Maybe we'll bundle one or two questions at a time, because then we can pick up on different things. But that's a very good question about kind of the difference as well between user versus platform liability, and where responsibility should lie and what comes back to a platform versus a user. Did you want to ask a question over here, and then we'll answer these two?
Hi, I'm Kshitij Singh, Managing Director, Knowledge Advisory. I have a slightly different slant to what the panel discussed, so I want to preface it with a short comment. I'm not sure if you're aware of this book by Balaji Srinivasan called The Network State, where he advocates the creation of nation states in Web3 through decentralized autonomous organizations. So essentially, if you are about 100,000, 200,000 people with similar values, views, you could come together, form a nation state, buy some real estate, have your own token currency, and sort of go about living, carrying on doing your business whatever way you want. Now, if we were to superimpose that idea on the three geographic domains we have in, three speakers. And if I were to ask you, should there be a number of DAOs created by radicalized or disenfranchised citizens, would that be in conflict with the nation state? Let's say in the US is perhaps most progressive where Web3 is concerned, Europe and the Asian subcontinent, given the subtext and the context of the many different threads we are going through right now. So be grateful for a comment. Thank you.
Okay, we could pick up on a lot of different sub-themes of these questions, but in essence, one is really about rights to users, but also protections around liability for users versus platforms, in the case of a young individual on OnlyFans who was arrested for their online content. And the other is really getting back to this idea of identity and nation states, the idea that we have these perhaps maybe unhealthy echo chambers in some cases of people online, like flat earthers, for example, and should they be allowed to congregate and create their own identity or mini nation state in the virtual sense in these decentralized web platforms. I will let our speakers take this in any direction they want to based on their own expertise, but maybe we'll start with Helani and work our way down.
I think the questions to ask in this situation are, was this a consenting adult who did this video out of free will and posted it? If she was getting paid, did she get a fair wage for this video that was posted? Or was she being exploited? Beyond that, I don't think it's the job of the state, particularly under protecting cultural values. I come from a predominantly Buddhist country, and Myanmar is the same. And the values are metta, karuna, mudita, and upekka, kindness, love, and so on and so forth. And this is a government that has shown none of those four to its citizens, in the previous 25 years, and then again in the last year and something, right? So this idea that this nation state is shamed by this woman who did an individual act is laughable, in my personal opinion. Now, the question is, can somebody force that content to be taken down? I don't think the Myanmar law has jurisdiction over Facebook. That's why she was sent to jail and nothing was ordered to the platform, right? Facebook operates there, it's the internet, right? And I don't think it's Facebook's job to moderate those either, but the first questions on consent, legality, and paid work are much more important than the other one, I think.
Really well said. Just moving down on this, again, these two questions bring up so many sub-questions that we might want to ask ourselves, but Sonja, where would you pick up on that, especially given, Europe is coming out with tons of laws as well that are almost leading the way for how people think of privacy versus safety versus free speech?
Germany and also Europe have taken important steps towards more regulation of social networks and also targeting the kind of design principles of social networks and the way how they deal with hate speech. With Germany, the NetzDG was introduced, and a Network Regulation Act was introduced in 2018, and now on a broader level, the DSA. So it requires, for example, networks to provide at least an address or a channel where users or organizations can turn to. And it also urges them to take down illegal content within 24 hours, I think. And there were already a lot of attempts to fine larger social media networks. The question is just like, how long do these fights take? Because in some cases, of course, the media companies, the social media networks, take it to court. So some major decisions can take some years, but it's definitely it's a good step towards regulation. And I was just briefly, I want to answer to the questions related to the DAOs. So I think, yes, there is a tendency and also trend that, for example, very libertarian circles who are not big fans of state, of governance, create their own tech utopias. But I just came back from El Salvador this year, where the president wants to introduce this Bitcoin strategy. And this is not going to be something that cadres or is something designed for the masses. I think in the end, very privileged people will profit from these tech utopias. And the problem is, even in the construction process of these DAOs or other initiatives, concerns are often left out what it means for the local communities. So yes, I think this is a concern and that has to be watched.
And maybe jumping to you, Adam, on the second question, there's also a very big difference if we're talking about online communities for communities that maybe have the luxury of having a proliferation of apps and platforms that they can be on. Like, I dare you to look at your phone. You probably all have about 50 plus apps on your phone right now. But in some parts of the world like China, you might just have one. And what does that mean for this idea of, decentralized web, cross-platform networking, that global, quick and easy way of jumping around the internet versus maybe users that are in China that are all their data, all the metadata, all the ongoings are conglomerated into one or two platforms?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very traditional / narrow-minded political scientist. So my assumption is the state is perfectly fine with online utopias until they start encroaching on the things that the state does. And when that means taxation and revenue and violence and eventually protection of social cohesion and morality and whatever else the state thinks is its domain, then those technological utopias will no longer be free of the state. The state will enforce its view because technological utopias have to live in territories, and those territories usually don't have armed forces. I mean, that's, we had this 20, 30 years ago, we had, the statement from Barlow about, states were going to disappear and we're all going to live in a world of, the internet, and I don't think DeFi and decentralized web is going to really fundamentally change the balance between states. China is the extreme, of course. Every technology that we've seen introduced has been channeled, captured, and used for state goals. Right? We saw that with the internet from the very beginning. We saw it with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. We'll see it with other decentralized technologies, and as you said, having one app in some ways protects you from lots of other threats, but makes you a target for one big threat, which is the state to gather data. So I am a traditional, very narrow-minded political scientist, so that's where I think the outcomes usually are, and China is the extreme version of it.
Yeah, there's been some interesting papers coming out recently about the idea of the fact that there's really no baseline globally agreed upon user protection structure. And so with these legislations coming out, we might be witnessing kind of a new online form of neo-colonialism, almost in a divide in how user data is maintained or sustained. I think we have time for just one last question, which is good. We have a question over here.
Mike Nelson with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But more importantly, before working at Carnegie, I worked in the Clinton White House, and before that on Capitol Hill. And I helped Barlow copy edit his declaration at Davos in 1997. And it inspired me to write something called Sovereignty in the Networked World. It was written in 1997, forecasting 2022. And I got almost everything right. But I have to do a revision because the technology is creating these new forms of community. My question for all of you, but particularly Adam, Secretary General Gutierrez proclaimed that his two big priorities were climate and digital. That was 4 years ago. COVID got in the way, but he's going back to digital. if he really wants to foster digital cooperation, and he really wants to use these platforms to bring people together and work together in new ways, what's the one thing you'd have him announce and focus on in the coming months? What headline would you like to see in the end of 2023 on how the UN is going to bring people together using these technologies? And I'm not talking about companies and regulators coming together to contain and control the companies. I'm talking about actions governments can do to empower people to do new things together.
Great, Adam, we'll start with you and then come back this way.
I just gave a long spiel about I'm a traditional political scientist. You asked me a question about the UN? What can the UN do to bring people together through data? I suspect there is some work to be done on standards on data flows, right? So increasingly that is being driven at the nation state and the regional level, and is driven by, a lot of geostrategic competition. It is possible, I guess, that this would be a place for the UN to step in to say that we have, larger development and other goals, development goals that we wanted to address, that the ability to share data globally is, a common good, and here are some standards that we could work on that thing.
Sonja, from your perspective, again, the kind of broader question underlying this is what would we love to see in an ideal world? What could course correct some of the concerns that we're having in this space?
I think there also has been a lot of cooperation and networking between important actors, key actors of civil society from all over the world. Also non-traditional UN staff, I would call them, hackers, info security experts. And these institutions are trying to also building up their own data centers. I think what we need is maybe more hope, because I think all these visions of the free internet and empowerment started to crumble extremely in the past years with disinformation wars, with tech companies and states cracking down on spaces that opened previously interesting new forms of communication and life. And I don't know what the next innovation is going to be, but yeah, I hope for more future-oriented, constructive ideas also.
And Helani?
I think, yeah, I agree that civil society should be at the table. And I think what my asks would be, one, at a very technical level, the kind of technology that allows users to make trade-offs between their privacy and data and to economically benefit from that. So that goes to the broad debate on global taxation, on data and the platforms, and how that goes down to users at an individual level, which is a really hard problem. Because the companies that pay the taxes are overseas and very small nations don't get it. And if the nations get it, the people don't get it. So it really has to translate, whether it's with a bot that you negotiate or whatever. Second, easier processes for people to deal with cross-border companies when their rights online are violated. Whether it is this nation state that they live in that violates it or the platform that violates it. It has to be easier than fighting a court case in Seattle or something like that. And that's really an international governance issue. And this has to be done with the private sector and government and civil society together. And we need real alternatives to the dominant platforms, be it through competition regulation methods or other methods, because there is no way that we can live in a world where we say Facebook is an option. For people in Myanmar, Facebook is the internet, right? Very soon it might be TikTok, but the point is, it is a provider of basic communications infrastructure, which used to be the domain of the government. And I think it's been done very well by the private sector and private capital for so long. But now we have reached the limits where governments also need to be able to provide, or somebody needs to provide an alternative, because if you're not in these platforms, if you're deplatformed, you're nowhere and you can't communicate. So 3 asks.
Okay, well, we have our wish list going forward into the future and things that we can all in this room perhaps look to, and perhaps an article that could be respread around, since your predictions seem to have been pretty accurate on many fronts. But also just that idea that maybe what's lacking are some, well, maybe it's the UN, maybe it's another body, but those baseline protections. What does that mean across the internet? And again, all those beautiful things that the internet gives us, like belonging, community, being international, being cheap, free, easy, fast, can also be reappropriated by violent networks or hate-based networks, using all those same beautiful tools to sometimes create ill, and that's what we're facing today. Thank you so much for your contributions on this panel. We could, I'm sure, talk for another few hours and write a few more PhDs, but if the audience could help me thank the panel, it has been really a pleasure.